So hello, everyone in the audience. It's good to see you. Thanks for joining us today for the webinar on schools, blood, guns, and bombs, education, Myanmar's pro-democracy struggle. I'll start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land. For those of you outside of Australia, the Australian practice is to give acknowledgements to country. And by that, we mean that we recognize and respect the traditional owners of the land upon which we are meeting. So here at the Australian National University, the campus is located on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We acknowledge the fact that sovereignty was never ceded, and the issues of sovereignty continue to be addressed now. We also pay our respects, not just to the elders past and present, but to the new generations that are coming forward as we speak. With respect to the webinar today, we work and talk in the context of the ongoing struggles in Myanmar. So at this time, as of November 2022, at the end of November 2022, the current situation in Myanmar has more than 13,000 people in detention. More than 2,500 people have been killed. More than 28,000 homes have been burned or destroyed. And Myanmar military junta is continuing to compile an ongoing list of human rights violations, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. International attention has waned a little bit over time since the February 2021 military coup. In response to that, this webinar series is trying to maintain international attention to the situation in Myanmar. This webinar today is actually the second in a webinar series that's co-hosted by the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, University of California, Los Angeles, the Asia Center at Harvard University, and the College of Law here at the Australian National University. The initial webinar that was earlier this year dealt with the role of lawyers in Myanmar's pro-democracy struggle. This webinar today is addressing the position of the education system within Myanmar's pro-democracy struggle. The reason why we focused on the education system and what's happening with the education system is, number one, there's a matter of timeliness. So within the past few months, the Myanmar military has escalated its attacks on education institutions. In September, there was an airstrike against a school. In October, the Tatmadaw had attacked a number of schools and had included beheadings of some of a teacher. And second, there's also a larger history and activity of Myanmar military actions against the education system, so that they've tried to manipulate the education system to advance an authoritarian system in the country. To address the issues of the education system in Myanmar, joining us today, we have a distinguished panel of speakers. I'll mention the two native Myanmar speakers that we have joining us for this session. So first is Dr. Su Yin Tun. She is a former Fulbright scholar to Columbia University in the United States. She was also a former professor of law at the University of Mandalay. She is currently involved in the civil disobedience movement as part of the National Unity Government Ministry of Education. So the National Unity Government is the pro-democracy movement in the current struggle. Dr. Su Yin Tun has expertise in human rights law, constitutional law. She's visited universities in Europe, including Central European University. She's also had visits in Asia, not just at ANU, but also National University of Singapore. Alongside Dr. Su Yin Tun is Dr. Yamin, and this is a pseudonym, and we've left her camera off to protect her identity. She is graduated from the University of Yangon. She worked for the Myanmar Ministry of Education for more than 20 years. She was and it continues to be a part of the civil disobedience movement. And as a matter of safety, she had to flee Myanmar as a refugee and applied for political asylum in the United States. She is currently a refugee. She has expertise in international human rights law and continues to try and support the pro-democracy struggle in the country. For commentary with respect to international human rights law, international humanitarian law, we also welcome the expertise of Dr. Kal Lok-Yip. So Dr. Kal Lok-Yip is assistant professor at Hamad bin Khalifa University in Qatar. Her expertise covers international law, social theories, and empirical studies regarding armed conflict and post-conflict settings, which is particularly apropos for our discussion today. And she has written extensively on issues regarding use of force, humanitarian issues, human rights law. She is also an experienced international lawyer and is actively involved in peace and justice initiatives in situations like Myanmar. So thanks all of you for joining us and giving us your insights. The format of today, in terms of how we will operate, we will have the initial session today as a roundtable. So there's a number of questions that we will give to the speakers, and they will give their insights. We will have time at the end. We will try to reserve approximately 20 minutes at the end of today for question and answer session. We recognize that for some members of the audience, your identities, you want to protect your identities. So what I would ask is that you can please post your questions in the Q&A function, which you should see at the bottom of the screen, the Zoom screen. I can read out your questions and omit your names, and I can direct your questions to the speakers. And then hopefully that will allow a measure of protection for your identities while still allowing discussion within the Zoom session. At the very end of today, I'll also request that each of the speakers offer some closing comments for further consideration for the audience going into the future. So with that, let's begin. So the first set of questions is for reflections from both Dr. Su and Ma Yamin, and it's the same questions for both. So Dr. Su, if it's okay, I'll start with you. Can you please summarize your experiences of what happened to you after the February 2021 military coup, and how you managed to arrive at a relative position of safety today?
Thank you very much, Dr. Jonathan, and very good morning to you all. Today is 5th December, so I wish all of you to have the very sweet December. So I would like to talk about very brief of my experience after the military coup. Actually, you all know that my country was the victim of military coup d'etat on February 1st, 2021, which occurred at a time when we need to be exerting ourselves to repair the problems of the COVID-19 epidemic and to promote the human rights and democracy within the very limited rights that we have under the 2008 Constitution. So, due to the fact that we had been subjected to military tyranny for the considerable amount of time, many decades ago in the past, the people of Myanmar, including myself, were unable to accept the military junta any longer because, I had seen the horrors committed by the military personnel in my country and not just in the books. So I was unable to recognize the military coup in any way. And as a result, I took part in the movement of civil disobedience. So in this point, I would like to define the term CDM, which refers to our movement as a whole, as well as our individual decisions to take action against the immoral and unconstitutional conduct of military. So, and just because we adhere to the CDM doesn't mean that we won't provide our service to the public. On the contrary, it means that we will struggle against the dictatorship imposed by the military, and that we will make every effort to educate the people. On the other hand, it seems that you are all aware that the military junta tried every method possible to eradicate our political right of CDM. So, these methods included issuing orders for martial law and amending the penal code to include harsh sanctions along with the arbitrary arrest. So only for the reason that I joined CDM and street demonstration while I enjoy my political and civil rights. So for this reason, I was issued an arrest warrant under Section 505E of the Penal Code on April 2021. So, this warrant was issued because of the fact that I participated in both activities of CDM and only demonstrations. So that in order to target those who have spoken out against the military coup, as well as those who have encouraged others to embrace the civil disobedience movement. So this section 505A this section 505A revised that new offenses are created as well as the existing offenses expanded. So this is the military juntas trying to prevent for our political efforts. So to tell you the truth, I got into a lot of trouble trying to avoid their arbitrary actions. After that, I stay hiding myself and trying to keep a low profile as much as possible. But, I was nevertheless questioned by the military personnel on several occasions. Even so, I count myself extremely fortunate that the militia did not verify my identity using an official photo. So I have been forced to relocate at least 6 times, I think, and maybe more times. So each time I have to take refuge in the locations that lack amenities such as bed, refrigerator, air conditioning, kitchenware, books, as well as Wi-Fi. So I lost many connections. So, okay, even though I haven't committed any wrongdoing, I have to live my life as though I were a native. So, I have many problems to go to shop, to see the doctors. So, at that time, there was a COVID-19 epidemic, fourth wave in Myanmar. So, it's very difficult for us to escape the military's actions. Nevertheless, I am grateful to the individuals who provided me with food, shelter, clothing, and trust in my political beliefs in order to preserve my life. So for this reason, I walk along with the people, for the people, and by the people. I continue to fight against the military dictatorship in order to ensure that our country will one day have a democratic future. So I intend to devote the rest of my life to advancing this cause and controlled at the federal state. Thank you so much. Sorry for my emotions.
Thank you, Dr. Suyinton. That's very important, and we welcome your thoughts. Maya Min, similarly, same questions for you. It's like, can you summarize the experiences that you had after the February 2021 military coup, and how did you arrive at a position of relative safety at this point in time?
Oh, yes. First of all, I would like to convey my special thanks to you and all from Australian National University who organized this eminent webinar for our people and our young generation. Yes, so already mentioned about the terrible situation in our country after 2021 military coups. This was second experience in my life that this is second military coup. I faced a lot of difficulty after military coup in 1988, and I don't want to suffer our generation to face such difficulty I faced throughout my lifetime in Myanmar. And I was announced in national news on March 8th that they would take action against the professor who led the CDM network in Yangon. And I was one of the professor in national news, and my colleague and my student, they called my mobile. At the time, I was having my dinner with my family. I didn't know about the news because after coup, we didn't watch the TV. The day after the announcements in national news, I left my home. And then I passed through the border with the help of as an illegal immigrant. And at the time, there was a COVID-19 pandemic in Thailand. So this is emergency. This time was emergency situation in Bangkok. They announced that this is emergency situation. I still with low profile because my photo was distributed in Thailand. So I couldn't go outside and I have to stay in the place where the organization arranged for my safety. I have a tragedy that because before I left from Thailand, my father passed away in Yangon. I couldn't greet his last time. Fortunately, I arrived to New York City in last year, and I got a chance to serve as a visiting scholar in Berkeley Law School. And then I tried to survive myself in here because I hate military coups, and we talked about only in the civil disobedience movement. This means that we are peacefully protest against military coups. We don't like dictatorship. This is not for ourselves because we love rule of law and democracy. Democracy is just incubation in our country. The military dictatorship again and again destroying our people and our generation. This is my tragedy and terrible nightmare in my life. I will never forget.
Thanks, Maya, and that was very compelling. A summary has been affecting or impacting the education system now. And can you describe the kinds of attacks that the Tatmadaw has launched against CDM teachers and students at this time?
Yes, thank you for this great question. This is a very good question. Actually, we all know that how the military treated the people, its people. Okay, so military junta has been destroying our education by intentional manner or as usual. So as thousands of CDMers boycott the military-run schools, so military face the lack of human resource, then military calls the new appointment teachers with low qualifications. So this is destroying the education system. And then military opens many departments in the universities. Example, law departments were opened at the universities where there was no before. So, and then military calls the students enrollment with low qualifications so that the parents can send their children to the schools. So, you know, the ways military took are the very intentional behaviors like before, like the past, because, you know, we Myanmar people experience 4 times of coup. So at all the 4 times of coups, military inhumanly treated the students and teachers so that they are under the military dictatorship. So now military amended the National Education Law 2014. So as you all know that it was amended at the last week of October. So, the amending in National Education Law removes the participation of scholars from ethnic groups in the National Education Commission. So, there are about 135 races in our country. Our country is very diverse with own culture, with own language, and with own customs. But military never recognized all of our ethnic culture and language. So, they removed the ethnic people from the National Education Commission. And then amending law nullified the Section 7 of original law that granted the self-administration of universities, degree college, and institutions. So, we want to go to the autonomous university. Now, military repeat the self-administration of the university. So universities are totally under the administration of military junta. So this is the military's intentional destroy to the education system. And then, the functions of teachers' unions, teachers' associations, and students' unions don't exist at all. So military removed the role of the union at the education center. So, in an institution or in an organization, the stakeholders' involvement is very, very important and critical point. So, the war approaching to the participatory democracy. But, this military junta don't consider about the participatory democracy, and they don't devote the democracy. So this is the military dictatorship. And then, Burmese language in the law amending, Burmese language must be taught in the classroom. So this amendment mandates that Burmese language be used as the primary language of the instruction at the elementary school level. So, the explanation may be in Burmese, even though the textbook is written in English. But, they approach the Burmese language as the official language like before they used in the past, several decades ago. So, the absence of that opportunity to learn by the ethnic children with their own language. This is far away from the democracy and far away the rights of the indigenous people. So I can confirm that military always neglects the ethnic children's rights to education with their own language. And they don't respect human rights as well as the self-determination of ethnic people and student-centered approach in education. So, without needs-based education, it is assured that military-controlled education cannot serve to the peace and developed nation. We cannot totally rely on the education of military. And then I would like to talk about the militaries attacking to the CDM teachers and CDM students. So we all know about the arbitrary arrestment, innocent people, including children, elder people, pregnant women. So inhuman investigation at the interrogation center, tortures in prison, attacks to school, extrajudicial killing, and then prisons court. So, all of our people cannot get the justice. We don't have rule of law. We don't have justice. We don't have human rights. And then we face the human rights violations and crimes against humanity, as you said at the introduction session. So after the military coup, military attacked the schools by airstrikes, burned down the schools, arrest the teachers and students, even the children under 18 and the 10 years old. So, I hope you all heard about the Layakong incident in which the troops raided and entered the village while the helicopters from above started to open fire at the school building within the monastery compound. So we learned that they targeted and attacked the schools and medical clinics. Only when all the troops had entered the premise of the monastery, they ceased fire from above and started shooting non-stop with their arms to the children. So when they arrived at the monastery compound, they used with heavy weapons using 60 millimeter, 40 millimeter calibers. So the school was filled with smoke from bombs, and there were helicopter noises and children's screams making a lot of noise. So, a shooting raid by the army in this Layakong village school resulted in 6 innocent children being shot and dying instantly in the classroom. So, 6 children were killed as a result, and terrorist army took away the dead bodies in sacks rather than giving them to their parents. So the parents don't have their children's body to bury. And then, in that case, 7 innocent adult people died in that incident, but their bodies were transferred to the family. But we don't get the dead bodies of our children. So this is for the disappearance of that case, so that we cannot get the justice, we cannot charge the court for these militaries' inhumane treatment. So, we have to consider about the transitional justice. So we are now taking the documentations of the military's inhumane treatment. So according to our data, 100 students and about 30 teachers have been massacred by the military junta after the coup. And 300 students and 200 teachers have been arbitrarily arrested by military junta. So, these all are our human resource. They enjoy only their political rights. They do peaceful protests. They don't accept the military coup. They want to promote democracy and human rights, but militaries inhumanely treated to our people, especially to the CDM teachers and CDM students, because they think that the leaders of these political organizations, if they kill them, if they kill or they force to stop those leaders of political organizations, the people will stop fighting against the military troops. So the military troops consider that bad. We never surrender. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Su. We'll turn now to Dr. Yip, so Ka Lok. Can you provide for the audience an explanation or an overview of the kinds of international law issues that you see in terms of the Myanmar military's conduct towards its education system?
Thank you very much, Jonathan, and thank you also to Dr. Su and Dr. Yamin for your very moving account of your experience, and I'm very honored to be in solidarity with this panel. I want to perhaps address the broader context of these terrible experiences, and then we move into the more individualized experience kind of articulated to us by Dr. Su and Dr. Yamin. Because it has got an impact, the way that this context has evolved and the way that this context is is characterized. So we heard at the beginning from Jonathan and also in Dr. Sue's account, the attacks on schools, the physical attacks on schools, which is quite critical to some of the more individualized experiences that we've heard also from Dr. Sue and Dr. Yamin, because although in our sort of current narrative, we very often used very quite liberally the term of war crimes, as well as crimes against humanity and so on. There is a slight distinction between the two, of course, in that war crimes can only be committed in war or in armed conflict as a technical term. And currently there is some uncertainty as to whether or not certain of the attacks actually occurred within the context of armed conflict. And it makes a difference primarily in this context because it's a non-international armed conflict. It makes a difference because if there were to be an armed conflict that serves as the context for some of the attacks that we have mentioned, then those would sort of constitute war crimes, and it would entail individual criminal responsibility at an international level. In the sense that, for instance, universal jurisdiction would apply, the people who actually ordered and committed and implemented these atrocities could be tried and held accountable universally, in any domestic court, as well as any sort of international institutions that would actually take jurisdiction over it. For instance, the ICC, the National Unity Government has declared, acceptance of the ICC jurisdiction. For instance, we don't know yet whether it would be implemented or whether it would proceed. The ICC would actually accept it, and whether investigation would be initiated in the future. But there is that possibility in the first place. On the other hand, if the situation or if the attack cannot really be said to have occurred in the context or has a nexus with a non-international armed conflict, then there will still be accountability measures. So, for instance, you could say that it's a human rights violation and we pursue remedies on that avenue, or we say that, or we use domestic law to hold these people accountable under criminal, for instance, or other sort of administrative constitutional law that may be applicable at some point in the future. Or if it constitutes a widespread systematic attack, then we hold them accountable as crimes against humanity, even without the occurrence of an armed conflict. So it is pretty important, therefore, for us to know whether some of these attacks that we've been talking about actually occurred in the context of an armed conflict. Now, the classification of the situation as an armed conflict has certain technical criteria to it. And currently, various international organizations have, either different views or they haven't actually made their views known. There are very well recognized non-international armed conflicts that pre-existed the military coup in 2021. And so we call them the ethnic armed organizations, the EAO, in Rakhine, Kachin, and Shan provinces have been recognized by the ICRC as constituting non-international armed conflicts. So to the extent that any of the attacks, physical attacks, occurred in those provinces or, in the context of those conflicts, then they would clearly constitute war crimes under various provisions of international humanitarian law. The UN organizations, on the other hand, have less vocal or less explicit classifications. the entity or the mechanism that predated the current independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, the IIMM, and that was called the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Myanmar, also acknowledged 4 non-international armed conflicts, or in these 4 regions of Rakhine, Kachin, Shan, and Wa. But the successor, if you like, the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, is not very explicit about that classification of the situation in Myanmar on the ground, nor is the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation in Myanmar. There isn't a specific, they do refer to, a conflict, but there is no specific delimitation of that conflict. So it's not very certain whether or not the main opposition, the National Unity Government, the conflict or the hostilities between the NUG and the military junta actually constitute an armed conflict in itself. Despite, of course, the alignment, we call the alignment between the UNG and the various armed, certain of the EAO, certain of the ethnic armed organizations, and despite, of course, the declaration of war, I believe there was a declaration of war issued, defensive war issued by the NUG. At some point, it's not so clear that that either that alignment or that declaration would escalate the situation or would render the situation as an armed conflict. And I would, of course, very much welcome the view of Dr. Siu and Dr. Yamin on this particular issue. I am myself from the region, and I've experienced also the 2019 Hong Kong protest. It is understandable because of the nature of education institutions that they are very often used as a kind of a rallying base, on the part of the opposition to the government to rally, support for the opposition, but at the same time also a very strategic place in the view of the government to secure control and so on in order to consolidate its power. So it is quite often, caught in the crossfire. And under international humanitarian law, if this were to be, classified as an armed conflict, there are also specific obligations on parties not to use the schools or any education institutions as, in a military way, precisely to avoid any incentive for people, in armed conflict to attack these schools. So again, it is therefore important as a threshold issue to characterize or to classify the situation currently on the ground in Myanmar, particularly with respect to the conflict between the NUG and the military junta. So I guess I might have run out of my time. So I mean, if I could sort of further address this issue and the other specific issues in international humanitarian law in its and its interaction with other bodies of law that might still be applicable even if we're not in an armed conflict.
We have a few extra minutes, and so I think it is worthwhile to sort of clarify the humanitarian legal issues on this.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, sure. So basically, if you like, the crux of the humanitarian law principle is the distinction principle. So anybody who's involved in armed conflict must make a distinction, so to speak, between civilians and non-civilians, so to speak. And of course, schools are by nature, by its by its use, supposed to be a civilian object. Okay, the only reason why we hear a lot of reports about attacks on schools, not just in Myanmar, but in Gaza, in a lot of these other places, is because of the allegation by the attacking parties very often that the school has been used for military purposes, because there is actually an exemption that even though by nature school is not a military objective, nonetheless it could be turned into a military objective. So in that sort of situation, it would actually be tolerated, or would actually be allowed under international humanitarian law for the school to be targeted, which sounds like a terrible thing, but and that is why one always needs to inquire into the origin of the armed conflicts in the first place. But if we're just looking at the international humanitarian law position, there is always that risk, and that is why there is also a specific obligation on the parties not to use the school for any military purpose. And so those are the kind of if you like, the key sort of takeaway from humanitarian law. And then once we classify the situation as as an armed conflict and humanitarian law applies, then a lot of the individual instances or experiences that we've heard from Dr. Su and Dr. Yamin would also be regulated by quite a specific regime of law and rules. So, for instance, the deprivation of liberty, which is a human rights obligation in all circumstances, anyway, would also constitute a war crime in an international, in a non-international armed conflict. This is something that's not really codified in Geneva Conventions and its additional protocol, but the customary international humanitarian law position is that if you deprive people arbitrarily of their liberty without any grounds that may be associated with the armed conflict, then that is a war crime committed with all of its attending consequences, such as universal jurisdiction and other international accountability measures. There would also be sort of the attacks on the persons. Okay, so we've been talking about attacks on schools, but the personnel related to the schools, the teachers and students and so on, attacks on them under international humanitarian law would also constitute a specific regime of intentional willful killing, violation of Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, also would constitute war crime. Indiscriminate attack on civilians also is a war crime, as well as, of course, intentional attacks on civilians. So those would be the key kind of sort of provisions in international humanitarian law we would look to for guidance on the conduct.
Thanks, Kyle Locke, for that very insightful commentary regarding the international legal issues. At this point in the webinar, I want to transition to looking forward. So we've talked about the problems that have occurred and are ongoing with respect to the education system in Myanmar. And now, at this point, we want to start thinking about how does the international community respond? How do sympathetic voices take action? So I'll direct the question to Dr. Sama Yamin. And can you provide for the audience your perspective as to the kinds of reforms that are necessary in Myanmar's education system for the future?
Oh, yes. I have experience with Asian education system, and I study in foreign countries like Japan and Australia. But when I arrived here, I understood that we need to have much reform after this coup, after military regime over. Because honestly speaking, throughout my study life in Myanmar, I was learning by heart. But my students, they have an opportunity to change from learning by heart to learning by doing in 2013 by the support of PepsiCo. And Professor Jonathan and the student from Australian National University, they came to our university and they teach our students, not only to students, but also teachers. They teach new idea and we could launch community legal education in our university compound. I mean that in Shan State, we could launch the community legal education, not only in Shan State, but also in the university law school. They launched community legal education in addition to our university legal education. In my understanding, we need to have much more rights and freedom in education. We should form student union and teacher unions, and we have to establish strong alumni organizations, associations for continuity and sustainability of our movement. And the education reform is not only for methodology, but also we must change the concept and our thinking for developing new ideas in our education system. This is my experience and knowledge. Even I was charged with Section 505A and Lawful Association Act. I always think about my colleague in Myanmar and my student. They are facing difficulty for their life and their safety and their future. I understand that they are staying in dark era. So we have to change that situation by education reform after this period. But until right now, we cannot receive much support from international community. So we must survive by ourselves, but we have to ask. We have to launch our voice. We have to speak up to international community to hear our voice. So our students, they should have right now the interior education. Other community members, I mean for other international scholars may think that the student can study through online platform, but this could not happen in our country because of shortage of electricity, and we don't have internet connection in some area, poor connection, and intentionally cut off the line and the tracing the line so the student cannot study well through online platform. So we have to manage the system which can provide the education for our students. At the same time, we have to continue lifelong learning for our teacher. In my case, I was a PhD degree holder, but I continue my study in here with the support of my host institution because I need to have much more international human rights law and networking. This is my idea for supporting my people and my students. I will never get up my commitment to our people and my students. So we will do reform as much as I can. We will share our experience and knowledge with our colleague and like Professor Jonathan and Dr. Yip, and we have a lot of international academia in our community. So we can collaborate and we can launch our networking to support our students to get education access in interior situation in our country. This is my idea that we need cooperation, we need support, we need strong commitment to achieve our goals. For me, this is the reform which we need to happen in our country after military regime over. We must have not only the regular education system, we have to develop vocational education at all. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Yamin. That's a very good insight as to the kinds of changes that are necessary for the education system in Myanmar. Dr. Su, with respect to the efforts currently by the National Unity Government, Ministry of Education, to satisfy these kinds of education reforms, can you provide the audience a summary of what of the efforts that are underway?
Okay, sure. Thank you. Very brief. So, with the NUG MOE is now doing all the possible ways to deliver the education to our people, not only for the students, but also for the people, because we are now trying to start the civic education and informal education to the students as well as the people. So there are 3 sectors under the NUG MOE, such as higher education, basic education, and vocational education sectors, in which CDM teachers voluntarily serve this interim education to CDM students as well as the people. So I would like to talk about basic education firstly. So MOE established the MBA channel. That MBA channel means the Myanmar Basic Education Home, that there are lecture videos and learning materials for the children for KG plus 12 education levels, as well as for the teachers to teach very conveniently. So I can see that UGB has sufficient human resource who can apply technology in this digital age. So there are about 300 township education boards who can take care of the children by the teachers in those areas. So those who have internet access and devices can study at home with the help of family or by learning from the CDM teachers nearby them. For those who cannot take internet access, we managed to send the flash drives in which we put the same materials with the MBA channel. Now we prepare the BECA process. That BECA means the basic education completion assessment for the students who turn 17 years old and passed the grade 9 level at the basic education. So this program is a bridge for the matriculation to the universities. We are now administering that BECA process online by the online assessment, offline assessment, and on-site assessment. That will depend on the security situation. So children who have the online internet access, they can take the online assessment of BECA process. For children who reside in the liberated area or less military control area, we will hold the on-site assessment like exam in those areas. So the children can take that easy assessment. And then we are now preparing to start the offline assessment system. We will use the application, mobile application, so that the students can take access. Okay, so you all know that military always disturbs the people, including the children. That means they don't respect the right to choose for parents and the education rights of the students, so that the parents can send their children to the military run school. So the military don't want to give the people the right to choose. So let me say about the higher education. We have 245 university interim councils that the stakeholders collaborate with the internally stakeholders, with the teachers and students and teachers unions and students unions, and some people from the CRPH or CRMH. So, now we deal with the students unions, teachers unions, and we have private institutes like private universities who wanna work with the NUG MOE. So now we are dealing with the private universities, and then we are now dealing with the 9 ethnic education councils, including Karen, Kachin, Taang, Pao, Chin, Karenni, Mon, and Rohingya. So let me say that there are progressive records at university interim councils that they collaborate with their internet stakeholders and try to solve informal education online or on-site with the proper ways. So, till now, we could not decide that we will provide the formal education because, most of the students don't want to take the formal education because they sympathetically consider for their friends who are in the prisons with the political prisoner status and who were killed by the military junta and who were in the People's Defense Force. So students don't want to take the formal education. So we don't go for the formal education until we get the students' recommendation to have the formal education. So for the NUG MOE, we have online universities that Myanmar University, MNOU, and Pre-Normal University to serve the interim education such as non-formal and formal and certified courses. And then let me talk about the vocational education sector. There are about 10 vocational education centers under the NUG MOE, and they serve at the different areas. At the liberated areas, they serve on-site education programs to the people for their vocational life, for the income generation, and for job creation. And there are many programs under the vocational education, such as continuous learning for students on Moodle platform. So at the vocational sector, they use the LMS system for the students who have the internet access. And then there are continuous professional development program, small scale production training, and public lecture for their vocational life. Under the NUG MOE, there are apparently capacity building programs and federal education program as well, because we have federal education policy. So now we're trying to set up the administrative structure under the federal education policy and as well as the academic structure. So NUG MOE's policy is approaching to the early childcare education, basic education, vocational education, higher education, and lifelong education. And then we take care of the education for disabilities and for ethnic peoples by the ways of human rights approach. And then we take care of the involvement of students' unions and teachers' unions, and then parents and communities as well. So we have now a school language policy under the NUG MOE, and then we have the Federal Democracy Charter that drafted by the NUCC. This is a kind of Bill of Rights. So there are grantees of human rights. You can find many provisions for the grantees of fundamental human rights. So now NUG MOE is trying to implement the federal education policy within many constraints like the security. So we have about 8 departments under the NUG MOE, like the CDM Affairs Department, like the Policy Department, and the International Affairs Department. So we trying to set up the structures to deal with the international organizations to serve the education for our people. So we try our best to serve the interim education in this interim period. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Dr. Su. The follow-up question that then arises, and this is for on behalf of the members of the audience who are working with international organizations that want to provide assistance, is what are the most effective ways for international actors to help the education system in Myanmar? And so I think, for both Dr. Su and Dr. Yamin, I'm curious as to what advice you would give to an international organization, to an international university, say in the US or in Europe, or Australia, elsewhere. Like, what advice would you give to them in terms of ways that they can help and to be effective in helping the education system? So, Dr. Yamin, maybe I'll ask you first.
Yes.
Like, what advice would you give to anyone who says that they want to try and help?
Yes, I just want to support what Dr. Su said about NUG endeavor for continuity of education in our country. So I would like to ask international community to support the educational system implemented by NUG. This is the reliable government for all people. And then for international organizations like UNESCO and regional organizations like Asian Development Bank, ADB, to support for our people as a community-based literacy classes in times of conflict in our country. And secondly, I would like to mention that the international institution and international academic university and institution, they should launch a higher education system for supporting our students and teachers for accessing to higher education and primary education, and we have these high school. And I also want to develop teacher training hub, because like in Afghanistan situation, Afghanistan after Taliban occupied in last year, in August, many Afghan teachers are now in Iran. They are continuing their training hub So I would like to ask international community to support our colleague CDM teachers. They are now in EAO place and in Thai Myanmar Bora. So I would like to ask international community to support our colleague CDM teachers and CDM students in Myanmar for get access to education. And we also need language training and support because we need to have the universality. I mean, for the education must be accessed by all people in Myanmar. We have diverse community, diverse ethnic minority, more than 135. So we need language training. And then language training means not only for Myanmar language, but also international language, especially English language training support for the students and teachers. Now they are taking part in the civil disobedience movement.
Thank you. Dr. Su, do you have your perspective on your advice for international actors?
Thank you very much. And today we have friends from international, and I think there are many people from international in this webinar, and I would like to request you to hear all of our voice from Myanmar. So we need international collaboration on education matter. So you know, millions of students, we have millions of students to who they have stopped their education since 2020 at the COVID-19 pandemic. So, you know, the universities were closed since 2020. And then, you know, students are getting older and older without education access. So we have to consider about their critical thinking, their physical development, and their political thoughts to help our community, because our community is very underdeveloped and our country is very poor. In 2021 and 2022, our economic stage is low down. So we need international collaboration to help our country to resume the education by 4A approach, by the universal human rights standards. So our students have to have the right to education. And then we need the international aid in cash or in kind, anything. We have many problems, you know, to implement the online education system. We have to have the device, we have to have the technique, we have to have the networking. So, you know, inside our country, there is very shortage of internet access, electricity, and then, you know, people lost their homes as the military burned down their home. So, you know, we have many troubles to serve the education or to take the education. So international needs to consider to help our community, to help our students. And then, you know, actually students want to learn the education, continuous education, by the way of formal or informal. So, you know, students who can get the internet access can learn the online education from the foreign universities. So foreign universities should consider to serve the online education to our students. So, you know, and then, you know, now international communities consider the documents, not the human. not the human-centered approach. You know, documents are more important than the man. So, you know, international communities and like the job opportunities consider the documents, certificates, degrees. So our students cannot have at all. So how our students can alive? So we have to consider about that. And then, you know, we CDMers get in trouble because of the security, because of incomeless, because of jobless. So, you know, we are now struggling to live for the right to life. So, you know, the right to life is essential things in this situation. So, you know, international community needs to help our continuous professional skills so that we can stay alive with the educational approach. And then I want to talk about the accreditation because, you know, in our country, I said about 12 private institutes and 9 ethnic education councils, and then NUG MOE trying to serve the interim education in this interim period, but we can provide only the certificates. We can provide the credits. But if international universities or international communities don't acknowledge our credits, don't acknowledge our education system, how can the students and teachers involve the international system, especially UN system? So we need to think about that. Please pay attention to our students and teachers. Please consider about the human-centered approach. Don't go to the sovereignty. Military took over the sovereignty. It is de facto. So, you know, international people might think about interference within the term sovereignty. I think it is not fair for us. So please consider we are the human. We are the teacher who want to provide the education to our people. So please help us. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you, Dr. Su, for the additional advice for the audience. With the time we have, I'll have comments from Dr. Yip on the kinds of legal and ethical issues that international actors have to think through when they're going to try and provide assistance for Myanmar's education system. And then we can, after that, we can go directly to the Q&A. And I see we have some questions already. So Kalok, what kind of advice would you give to international organizations or international actors who want to try and provide assistance?
Thank you. From an international law perspective, these difficulties with the education system in Myanmar, of course, there's a root cause, which international law is perhaps intended to address. Okay, so for the violations of the international humanitarian law obligations, it is actually one of those bodies of law that is not particularly well enforced. And one of the questions raised by the audience is that there is also a disalignment between the PDF and the other ethnic armed organizations, and why don't we talk about it? And I think that that is also relevant in this analysis, because a lot of these international humanitarian rules are in fact intended to be abided by the parties. Okay, well, unless you get an international organization such as the ICC involved, which I think we're trying to do, but we don't know yet whether it's going to realize. There are also a couple of international mechanisms established by the Human Rights Council that one could look to. I've already mentioned the International Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, which is collecting evidence on attacks on the education system and other human rights violations. There is also the Standing Special Rapporteur on the situation in Myanmar with a similar kind of a mandate, but more general and less specific on the current situation. There is also, away from humanitarian law, there are also human rights mechanisms that could be utilized. Unfortunately, Myanmar is one of the few countries that have got relatively few ratification of human rights treaties, so less reliance should be placed on the treaty bodies mechanism. It is nonetheless party to a couple of very essential human rights treaties, such as the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which does contain the right to life, for children. And there is also the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which they are party to. Now, they don't accept, Myanmar has not accepted individual complaints mechanisms. So individuals can't really launch a complaint, but there would be reporting obligations that would, serve as a platform for civil society to galvanize efforts to, expose the inadequacy and to address the needs. There is also an obligation on other countries under the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights to initiate cooperation and to provide assistance to to achieve full realization of the economic, social, and cultural rights, which should be looked into. What sort of obligations should international parties or other states be placed under? Various speakers have talked about the initiatives by perhaps international organizations or even private organizations, not NGOs, to facilitate sort of education, cross-border education services. And I wanted to mention that because I work in Qatar, that some of the universities in Afghanistan have actually relocated to Qatar, and there are, model and sort of, pilots that could be used as a model on how Myanmar might want to kind of think about its future. So I'd be very pleased to talk to Dr. Su and Dr. Yamin.
Right. Thanks for that. And so now we have time for Q&A. Now I want to try and address some time for Q&A because there were some important questions. And following the previous comments at the start, I'll avoid mentioning names of people who are asking questions just to protect identities, and I'll direct the questions to the speakers. So the first question, I think, which is to follow up what Kalok had just mentioned, is there's a question about trying to clarify the relationship or status with the PDFs, the EAOs, and the NUG. It appears that the PDFs and the EAOs, so People's Defense Forces and ethnic armed organizations, are not all in alignment with the NUG. And so I think maybe Dr. Su is the best person to answer that. And can you provide commentary about the status of that relationship?
Can I answer first?
Yes, please. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So thank you very much for the questions. Actually, all of the questions are very good and critic, and you concentrate our webinar and you give your enthusiasm to our country. Actually, military use the centralization method. So, military wants to prevent the actions of the CSOs. So, the military, that's why military amended the CSO registration law. So, this is actions to contrary against the global governance, because globally we agreed that CSOs participations and the role of CSOs are really important in the country's progressive actions in this 21st century. But military trying to restrict the actions of CSOs to helping the communities and people. And then maybe they want to govern the CSO with the military dictatorship system. And then, NUG has the online education system for all of the people in our country, that, we have to take care of the security. So, we are now, that's why we are now considering for the CDM students, because of our security, because of the security for the CDM teachers as well as the CDM students, because, military acted the private schools, online schools, by the hacking of the internet, and then military arrested the private school like the Count for You school and other federal online schools. So we cannot. That's why we cannot give the education to the non-CDM students. That's why. So we only take care of the security. If we don't take care of the security, we can give our education service to all the people, because we want to serve the education for our country. And then for the education language system, as I said before, we have the federal education policy and we have the federal democracy charter. In both documents, we grantee the ethnic language policy at the schools. So now we are now reforming the curriculum and syllabus with the ethnic language. So we will go for the ethnic language-based education. So please let's wait and see how we implement the Federal Democracy Charter and Federal Democracy Education Policy. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for that answer. So the follow-up to that question also is about the PDFs, or the People's Defense Forces, and that some of the People's Defense Forces have also been attacking schools as well. And so I'm curious if you have comment about those kinds of problems. So Dr. Su, maybe you should answer that question.
So this question is also for me. Okay, thank you very much. Actually, we admit that there are dozens of PDFs. There are dozens of PDFs who collaborate with NUG, MOD, and who don't collaborate with NUG, MOD, because some PDFs state with their own status, and they collaborate with the NUG, MOD as alliance, not collaborate at all. So we have several. We have dozens of PDFs, but it is difficult to prove that the PDFs attack the schools. It is very difficult to prove that, because NUG has problems to govern on the ground, and then those actions, whether those actions will happen by the PDFs by the military junta, we cannot identify that. But under the NUG MOD, we have many education programs to PDF, to respect the international humanitarian law and to respect the international human rights law. And then we have the administration system like the Pa'apa, Palapa. So this is people administration force at the specific region. So for those people who are under the Pa'apa, Palapa, we have the education system, we have the education programs, how to administer within their region. So it's like the rule of the local government that created by the NUG. So we give the education program and awareness raising program to respect the people according to the international humanitarian law. So we are now trying to do our best to respect the people.
Okay, thank you. We're coming up at the end of the hour, and I do want to allow final comments from all of the speakers. I think we've addressed, there were other questions, but I think Dr. Su's answers and previous comments from Ma Yamin actually addressed the substance of those questions. And then there was one question about ways that the audience who want to help can contact either the NUG or other Myanmar civil society organizations that are trying to provide education. My suggestion is that maybe to protect identities and just as a matter of safety, anyone who wants to help, you're welcome to send an email to me, myself at ANU, and then I can put you in contact with the speakers in a way that's safe, you know, in a safe space. And so in other words, we'll do this offline if that's okay. Let's turn to final closing comments then. So I would like to begin with Dr. Yip. So Ka Lok, if you have final comments.
Just a very quick follow-up point on that issue about PDF and the YAO. I think that it highlights also a very important point that we didn't have time to cover, in that also based on Dr. Su's account, if there were to be misalignment or disalignment between the PDF and the other YAO, or that perhaps the PDFs, you know, countrywide don't really speak in one voice, in that they seem to be, you know, taking slightly different political lines, that would actually affect one of the criteria for classification of conflict. So one of the classification criteria is that you need to have a degree of organization within one armed party, one armed, you know, a conflict party. And if they are not actually able to speak in one voice, that kind of undermines that characterization. So it's an important point to note. The other point is, of course, the intensity of the conflict itself. So I just wanted to, you know, cover this point just to make the account a bit more complete.
Thanks for that. And then Ma Yamin, do you have closing comments that you want to offer for the audience?
Yeah, I would like to tell the audience that please listen our voice. And please support our people. We are now in most difficult of our lifetime. So please don't left behind the things from the world. We are facing internal conflict, not internal conflicts. This is the most serious crimes are committed in our country. So please support our people and our young generation, our colleagues. This is my commitment that I will never give up my commitment and my belief that I love truth and justice as a person who have been in legal profession for more than 20 years.
Thank you, Ma Yamin. Dr. Su, you'll have the last word.
Thank you very much. And my colleagues already said before, so I don't want to talk a lot. So I want to wish all of you this month of December is a wonderful time for all the people. So everyone should have a joyous time because there are several holidays during which we can relax and think about all of the hard work that we have accomplished during the year. As for us, we have a responsibility to ensure safety for our people in Myanmar because the military frequently exercise its heavy weaponry on the significant days. In the last Christmas Day, military used the heavy weapons to the Karen state, Kachin state, and Korean state as well, because in those states there are people who pray the Christian religion. So now, in this December, we have to take care of the military's inhumane treatment in our country. So I kindly ask that you continue to send us your hands. We are fighting against the military dictatorship that take very long time. So we need your encouragement and your support and your solidarity. So please let's continue to be united. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So I think we'll end there, and thanks to all the speakers for very insightful comments. Thanks to Dr. Su and Ma Min for their personal accounts and for the insights that they offer for the audience. Thanks, Dr. Yip, for the expertise in sort of thinking through the different kinds of issues, legal issues that we should all think about. My only closing comment I'll note is that those of us who have been following Myanmar for a while, ever since the February 2021 military coup, have been warning both the entire region as well as the larger global community that Myanmar should not be seen as an isolated problem, that throughout its post-independence history, Myanmar, or even when it was known as Burma, was always producing impacts that affected all of Southeast Asia as well as Asia, and that the current crisis is actually going to escalate that. And so simply ignoring the issue actually will compound the growing deleterious impacts of Myanmar for the entire region. And if anything, right now, only in the past couple of months, I'm sad to say, I think that the Association of Southeast Asian Nations is finally starting to acknowledge the fact that the situation in Myanmar is starting to destabilize the surrounding countries. So it's wiser action for the larger international community to try and take some kind of mitigative action. There are clear alternatives to the Tatmadaw that have been presented to you. There are very clear voices that are very interested in engaging with the international community and that have made efforts to try and comply with international norms and are very much interested in trying to build constructive relationships with the larger international community. And the National Unity Government in particular is in the process of carrying those efforts forward through a National Unity Consultative Council that is trying to assemble and unify all of the pro-democracy voices in Myanmar. And so as a result, if those of us who want to have a stable, globally engaged, receptive future for Myanmar that is consistent with international norms, that is willing to interact with the rest of the international community, and is also willing to be sympathetic towards international interests with regards to Asia as a whole, I think would be well advised to try and provide assistance as requested for the National Unity Government, the Ministry of Education, and in particular the education efforts that are underway right now. So we'll stop there, and thanks everyone for attending today. And the recording will be available after the end of this webinar. All right, thank you and take care.